After his wife's funeral, Alexander Gray went to claim his inheritance. But when he arrived at the notary's office, the somber notes of a piano filled the air as mourners filed out of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. At the center of it all stood Alexander, his face a carefully composed mask of grief as he accepted condolences from a long line of acquaintances and well-wishers. His wife of 30 years, Evelyn Gray, was gone, struck down suddenly by what the doctors had labeled a heart attack. Alexander cut a striking figure in his tailored black suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled despite the unseasonably warm autumn day. At 58, he still turned heads, something he was well aware of and often leveraged to his advantage in both business and personal matters. "She was a wonderful woman," said Harold Collins, a portly man in an ill-fitting suit, clasping Alexander's hand. "Evelyn will be sorely missed." Alexander nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Harold. Your support means a great deal." As Harold moved on, Alexander's eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on a statuesque blonde standing near the back. Eleanor Hart, officially his executive assistant, was unofficially much more. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of understanding passing between them before Alexander turned his attention back to the mourners. The receiving line seemed endless, but Alexander played his part perfectly, the grieving widower, graciously accepting sympathy from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had read about Evelyn's passing in the society pages. Evelyn had been beloved in the community, her charity work and kind nature earning her a reputation as a true lady. If anyone noticed that Alexander's eyes remained dry throughout the service and reception, they were too polite to mention it. As the last of the mourners departed, Alexander felt a hand on his arm. He turned to find Detective Linda Ramirez, a woman he vaguely remembered from the initial investigation into Evelyn's death. "Mr. Gray," she said, her voice low and professional. "I wonder if I might have a word." Alexander felt a flicker of annoyance, quickly masked by a look of weary acceptance. "Of course, Detective, though I'm not sure what else I can tell you." The medical examiner was quite clear about the cause of death. Ramirez nodded. "I understand, sir. It's just a few follow-up questions. Standard procedure." Alexander led her to a quiet corner of the church, away from the few lingering guests. "What can I do for you, Detective?" "I was hoping you could clarify your whereabouts on the night of your wife's passing," Ramirez said, her eyes sharp and observant. "You mentioned you were working late, but we've been unable to confirm that with your office." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine, but kept his expression neutral. "As I explained before, I often work from home in the evenings. I was in my study when I heard Evelyn collapse in the bedroom. I called 911 immediately." Ramirez made a noncommittal sound, jotting something in her notebook. "And you didn't see or hear anything unusual earlier in the evening? No visitors or phone calls?" "No," Alexander said firmly. "It was a quiet night. Until it wasn't." The detective studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Gray. We'll be in touch if we have any further questions." As she walked away, Alexander allowed himself a small frown. Why was the detective still asking questions? Surely a simple heart attack didn't warrant this level of scrutiny. He was pulled from his thoughts by Eleanor's approach. She looked stunning in a conservative black dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a tasteful chignon. "Alexander," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Alexander nodded, aware of the few remaining guests who might be watching. "Thank you, Eleanor. Your support during this difficult time has been invaluable." They held each other's gaze for a moment longer than was strictly professional. Eleanor broke the silence first. "Will you be heading to the notary's office today?" "Yes," Alexander replied, his voice low. "I think it's best to get these matters settled quickly." "Closure." Eleanor nodded, a hint of something eager in her eyes. "Of course. Would you like me to accompany you as your assistant? To help with any paperwork?" "I mean," Alexander considered for a moment. It was risky, perhaps, to be seen together so soon after the funeral. But the thought of facing the reading of Evelyn's will alone was unappealing. "Yes, I think that would be helpful." Thank you. As they made plans to meet at the notary's office, neither noticed the watchful eyes of Detective Ramirez, who had paused at the church entrance to observe their interaction. An hour later, Alexander sat in his Mercedes, parked outside the nondescript office building that housed Mr. Bernard Jameson's notary practice. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of shock, secret relief, and carefully orchestrated grief. He had played the part of the devastated widower to perfection, all the while counting down the days until he could claim his inheritance and begin a new life with Eleanor. Evelyn had been a good wife, loyal, kind, and supportive of his ambitions. But somewhere along the way, Alexander had grown restless. Eleanor had reignited a passion he thought long extinguished, and the promise of a fresh start, funded by Evelyn's considerable fortune, had been too tempting to resist. A knock on the car window startled him from his reverie. Eleanor stood outside, looking expectantly at him. Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. It was time to close this chapter of his life and begin anew. As they walked into the building together, Alexander felt a mix of anticipation and unease. He was eager to learn the details of his inheritance, to finally have free reign over the wealth Evelyn had brought to their marriage. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that things might not be as straightforward as he hoped. Little did Alexander know, as he and Eleanor entered Mr. Jameson's office, that the next hour would upend everything he thought he knew about his late wife, his future, and the carefully constructed life he had built on a foundation of lies and betrayal.